Welcome. I'm Olivia Mattis, and I'm delighted that you've joined us for another Sunday program of the Sousa Mendez Foundation. Usually we show films and have film discussions. Today, unusually, we're having a book talk. We're featuring a brand new book by one of our favorite speakers, whom you know well. You've seen on many of our programs. That's Dr. RAFAEL MEDOFF. He has this very important book that's come out from Dark Horse Press and Yoe Press with a foreword by Susanna Heschel and co-authored with Craig Yoe. It's called Cartoonists Against Racism, The Secret Jewish War on Bigotry. And it tells the fascinating story about how just before and during World War II, there was a secret campaign that he'll tell you all about, sponsored by the American Jewish Committee, to engage cartoonists to persuade hearts and minds all across America against anti-Semitism, in the fight against anti-Semitism. And we're, of course, going through another such period. We need every tool at our disposal, and I'm delighted to feature this book. We're putting a link in the chat box as to how you can order a signed and inscribed copy of the book for yourself or a loved one. We have just a few copies left. Today is your last opportunity to order a signed and inscribed copy, and I hope you will. So we have two fabulous speakers on today's program. One, of course, is Dr. Medoff himself. He will start us out with some introductory remarks about the subject. He is, of course, the founding director of the David Wyman Institute, and he is one of the world's authorities on America and the Holocaust, America's inaction during World War II, except for, of course, winning the war, but not saving all that many Jews, or not as many as we ought to have. So that is what Raphael devotes his life to pursuing. We are also privileged to have a contemporary cartoonist who goes by Gorf. His name is Jordan Gorfinkel. And he's going to talk about the work that he does using this medium of the cartoon, the graphic novel, to educate, to enlighten, to persuade, to delight. All on a Jewish theme. He has a website called jewishcartoons.com. He also has an Instagram page. We're going to put links in the chat box. And so you'll hear all about his fascinating work. Most notably, he's done a graphic novel of the Passover Haggadah. So if for your next Passover, you have reluctant Haggadah readers, this might be a way to go. And I'm delighted to have both of our wonderful speakers here with us today. So Raphael, why don't you get us started?
Thanks, Olivia. And thank you to the Sousa Mendez Foundation and to your whole terrific team for giving me the opportunity to speak about Cartoonists Against Racism. When my co-author, Craig Yoe, and I began working on this book 3-4 years ago, we could not have foreseen how topical it would become. There was, of course, anti-Semitism a few years back, but it wasn't on the scale or of the nature that we're facing today. I'm sure many of you recall 2-3 years ago, it was that series of attacks in Brooklyn on people wearing Jewishly identifiable clothing, a number of violent assaults. But obviously things have become much worse and changed in various ways since then. I also want to thank Charlotte Bonelli, the archivist at the American Jewish Committee. She's the one who first called my attention and that of my co-author to this remarkable story, which she discovered essentially hidden away in the dusty filing cabinets at the American Jewish Committee's archives, a story of how their organization had quietly enlisted comic book artists and cartoonists in the fight against anti-Semitism back in the 1940s and 1950s. And in a few minutes, I'll be rejoining you to share with you a number of examples from Cartoonists Against Racism and insights into the backstory of this remarkable but little known effort to combat racism and anti-Semitism in American society through the very unique medium of comics and cartooning. But first, it's my honor to turn the mic over to my friend and colleague Gorf, who, as a comic book professional, will be able to share some of his experiences and set a broader context for today's discussion. Gorf?
Thank you, Dr. Raphael. Thank you, Olivia, for that introduction. If we can start the slideshow, we'll jump right into it. My background is that I was the editor-manager of the Batman franchise for the better part of a decade. And during that period of time, I learned how to tell visual storytelling, sequential storytelling, comics or graphic novel storytelling on the highest possible level. Next slide, please. And I'm going to give you a little bit of my background. I created a storyline called Batman No Man's Land, which ran through all of the Batman comic books for an entire calendar year. And if you, or I'm sure some of your grandchildren or children or friends have seen the movie Dark Knight Rises, one of the Christopher Nolan Batman movies, it is based partly on this work. I also created Birds of Prey, the longest running female group superhero franchise in the history of comics. And sometime you'll have to invite me to your community to tell you how this was actually based on the Jewish women that I know and love in my life and who are the real superheroes for me. Next slide, please. I have then taken my storytelling abilities and applied it to Jewish causes. One of them is the Shoah and specifically anti-Semitism across the ages. Here you see the entrance of the permanent exhibition to the Munich Jewish Museum and a cartoon series that I created. I was invited by the Munich Jewish Museum to create this series because they wanted newspaper cartoons specifically to be able to use as a marketing tool in addition to plastering them on the wall for people to be introduced to the understandably difficult subject of the Jewish non-Jewish relationship in Germany in the 20th century. And I like to say that I must have done okay because so far nobody has taken a fresh coat of paint to the wall. The cartoons are still there. You see them in the original German above and the English translation on the bottom. Next slide. Now you're seeing the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum project that I did, which was 10 graphic novellas, which are shorter form graphic novels that focus on the root causes of the Holocaust and compare them to other genocides so that people can see that genocide is not a Jewish specific subject. It is something that happens, unfortunately, to many people across our history and across our globe. And as Dr. Raphael said before, when I worked on this, I did not imagine that the word genocide would be, shall we say, such a hot button issue right now, and that this is as current and relevant as ever before. Next slide. I also take my background in creating entertainment to doing Jewish subjects, such as our books of our heritage. This is the Passover Haggadah graphic novel, in which I literally took the ancient text that goes back 2,000 years and created a Batman or Avengers or Marvel style graphic novel out of it so that it would be engaging, enlightening, and even educational for everybody. Next slide. And as we go through the process of how we create comics and graphic novels, you will see how I've taken that Batman experience and applied it towards Jewish causes and subjects and themes and come out with a way that is absolutely timeless and applicable to people of all backgrounds and educational levels and ages, Jews and hopefully non-Jews as well. The process of creating a graphic novel, a cartoon, a comic is first the brainstorming. It starts with conceptualizing and designing and researching. Next slide, please. For a Jewish graphic novel that is based on one of our sacred texts, and here we are using the Haggadah or the Haggadah as our basis, it always starts for me with the original text. I am not creating an adaptation. This is not like taking a Harry Potter book and creating a movie version out of it, which will abridge it and change it in some way. My philosophy is that our Jewish background is so wonderful that if we just apply the Jewish conceived and created medium of graphic novels and cartooning to our original texts in their original form, we will bring out what is already inherently great about it. So next slide, please. You can see that on this page over here, taken from the Haggadah, we have the original Hebrew, or in this case, Aramaic language, and then the transliteration underneath, because I want to make it as adaptable to, as understandable to people as possible. I don't presume that everybody can read Hebrew. Next slide. And this will be paired, as you will see, with the graphic novel page, which infuses the original text, unabridged, with the graphic novel art. But first, we have to determine what is that graphic novel art going to be. So we write a script. Next slide, please. And this script, as you can see, contains a list of the different panels. Panels are the boxes that we draw the cartoons in, and a description of what the artist should draw. So as a creator, I'm not only responsible for coming up with the words, I also have to be a film director in a sense and design the pictures too. Next slide. Then we pencil. Penciling, next slide, is the temporary version that we use in order to figure out what are we going to see and how is it going to be laid out. And here you see an example from the wonderful, amazing Israeli artist Erez Tzadok from Netanya in Israel. I try to use Israeli artists as much as possible because they bring a real authoritativeness and authentication from simply being in the land of Israel. And if we go to the next slide, you're going to see another interesting example. This is the pencils, or the earliest stage drawing from a Transformers comic. As those of you who know, Transformers was a toy series, and then it became comic books and graphic novels and TV shows and movies and so forth. And I ping-pong between doing regular entertainment and Jewish entertainment as well. So we're going to ping-pong here between the two as well. The next slide, please go ahead, is inking. Inking is when we trace over, but actually it's not just tracing, it's bringing a certain style, a chiaroscuro black and white style to the pencils. And the reason, next slide, that we ink is because originally when we were using photochemical processes before the digital age, you couldn't pick up the pencils very well, but by putting it in indelible ink, in India ink, then you could see all the drawing. And here are the inks for the Passover Haggadah graphic novel. And you will see in the next slide that we also have the color stage. And the color stage is, of course, when we bring it, next slide, to the eye-popping full color stage, where we bring it to life using all kinds of now modern digital methods. Next slide. And this process is then we add to this process with lettering. Next slide. The lettering process is when you put the words in. But first we have to figure out how are we going to put the words in so you understand the flow of the story. We put them in word balloons that point to the characters. Next slide. And by doing this, combined with a script that only uses the actual words that are going on the page. We have stripped out all of the shot descriptions. Now it's just the words. Next slide. We can combine them together into the final page. And then if we go on, you can see, next slide, that we I forgot about the editing part. That's the most important part, right? Making sure that we don't have any mistakes, God forbid, because we know how it is in Judaism. If you make a mistake, we throw tomatoes. Everybody is an armchair scholar. Next slide. And here in Transformers, you can see we've also done the same thing. We've combined the lettering and the artwork and made some final edits. Until next slide, we bring it all together into a folio. A folio is when you have two pages side by side. That's the fancy word for it. And you can see now that we have the original Hebrew Aramaic. We have the transliteration so that everybody can read it. And then we have the original text that is combined together, fused together organically with the art, so that the combination of the words and pictures fused together brings you text and subtext. It brings you the surface meaning, but it also enables you to dig deeper into all of the allegories and the commentaries and so forth that we've built in as Easter eggs, or as I like to call them, roasted eggs. And finally, on the next slide, we see that this is another example of a folio. Next slide. And finally, we see that we have to distribute it. We have our super team. In the case of the Passover Agadah graphic novel, it's the wonderful publishers at Koren Yerushalayim who distribute it, who market it, who make it available. And we, of course, are making it available to you as well. All of our Koren Tanakh graphic novel books. You can go to jewishcartoon.com and get more information, and we will share in the text further contact information as well. My 10 minutes are up, and now it is my pleasure to turn it back over to Dr. RAFAEL, who is going to bring us back into the past and show us how this medium that enables us to take the Jewish conceived graphic novel art and apply it towards not running away from our Judaism, but embracing our Judaism. Dr. RAFAEL, over to you.
Thanks, Gorf. Boy, have times changed. The graphic novel that Gorf has just described is now, a staple of popular culture. Some graphic novels are even bestsellers. Gorf himself has created this extremely unique Passover Haggadah in the form of a graphic novel, something which would have been inconceivable decades ago, certainly. And so when I tell you about the campaign that we described in the book Cartoonists Against Racism, speaking about something which was very unusual for its time. Back in the 1940s, 1950s, the comic book style storytelling was for entertainment purposes only. The idea of using comics or cartoons as for educational purposes, or in this case, to combat racism, was really a cutting edge approach. The American Jewish Committee came up with this idea, which was so different from its normal strategy was quiet behind the scenes diplomacy and standard educational type publications. But in the wake of the Kristallnacht pogrom in Nazi Germany in 1938, senior officials of the American Jewish Committee became concerned that if they did not undertake a more active means of combating anti-Semitism, that such horrors might even one day be visited upon Jews in America. So this entire concept of using comics and cartoons to fight anti-Semitism actually was born out of what American Jews were seeing happening overseas. 1938, the year of the Kristallnacht pogrom, was also the year that Superman debuted, and comic books were just then beginning, and they got a fast start, became very popular very quickly. When the American Jewish Committee decided they needed a more active strategy, or at least an unorthodox strategy for fighting anti-Semitism, they turned to a professional advertising executive, Richard Rothschild, who had no particular experience fighting anti-Semitism or racism or any particular relationships with cartoonists or comic book artists. But he was well aware of the impact that Superman and the other early superhero comics were having. And it was Rothschild who conceived the idea that maybe this new popular form of entertainment could actually be used to advance the much more serious objective that the American Jewish Committee had in mind. So Rothschild assembled a team who worked behind the scenes. And when I say behind the scenes, all of the samples of anti-racism and anti-Semitism materials I'm about to share with you were done not under the auspices of the American Jewish Committee for public purposes. We never find the AJ Committee's name attached to any of this. The committee and Rothschild believed that if it was known that the campaign was being sponsored by Jewish organizations, that it wouldn't be taken as seriously, because obviously the Jews had a, so to speak, a vested interest in this effort. So the whole aspect of Jewish sponsorship was kept out of the public eye. And that's what my co-author Craig Yoe and I meant when we subtitled the book The Secret Jewish Campaign Against Bigotry. It was the Jewish aspect of it which was kept secret. You know, there are many different ways, there are many different ideas as to how to most effectively combat anti-Semitism. There are those today and then who believe that fighting anti-Semitism should be subsumed within general fight against intolerance in society. And in fact, that the Jewish element should be completely suppressed. And then at the other end of the spectrum, there are those who believe that the more effective way to fight anti-Semitism is to focus specifically on discrimination against Jews and not mistreatment of other minority groups. What we're about to see in these samples from the book Cartoonists Against Racism is that Richard Rothschild and the American Jewish Committee adopted a kind of a middle approach. We'll see that in the works created by these cartoonists, it's an attack on racism in general, on racism against various specific groups, and including specific attempts to discredit anti-Semitism. What the team that Rothschild hired from the world of comics and cartooning included both comic book artists as well as what we call editorial cartoonists. That is, those who create the editorial cartoons that appear in the pages of major newspapers. One example was Eric Godal. Godal was the cartoonist for a New York City daily newspaper, which is no longer published, called PM, and he addressed the subject of anti-Semitism many occasions. Some of the cartoons that he drew, like this one, were ones for which he was recruited by Rothschild. These kinds of cartoons were then taken by Rothschild and his staff, and they would try to convince editors around the country to publish them in their newspapers. Here we see Godal comparing anti-Semitism in pre-Nazi Germany to outbreaks of violence against Jews and Jewish institutions in New York City in 1944. The Rothschild's team also had stories, comic book style stories that were created and placed in mainstream comics. In this next example, we see a traditional looking comic book story, which appeared in a major comic. It was called True Comics in 1943. They Got the Blame shows throughout history examples of innocent minority groups being bullied or persecuted or killed. And the Jews are included in this story, but the Jews are only one aspect of what They Got the Blame describes, in keeping with this philosophy of the American Jewish Committee. Part of the work of this secret campaign against racism involved convincing the creators of existing comic books and comic strips, newspaper comic strips, to incorporate pro-tolerance messages in their existing storylines. Here's a page from the famous newspaper strip Lil Abner, in which racism is mocked by having a clash between people with round eyes and people with square eyes, a way of making intolerance seem silly. Rothschild convinced Al Capp, the creator, writer, and artist of Lil Abner, to incorporate this storyline as part of the regular series of tales about Lil Abner and his cohorts. Rothschild's group also initiated a series of one-panel cartoons called Mr. Bigot, obviously a very thinly disguised way of looking at someone who they considered to be the typical racist. This Mr. Bigot, who you see here being rescued from a fire, is portrayed in each of these one-panel cartoons as being so ridiculously racist that it's impossible to agree with him. That was the idea behind it. And again, Rothschild would approach individual newspaper editors around the country and ask them to run these Mr. Bigot cartoons. Here we have Mr. Bigot being rescued, but his main concern is that he's being rescued by what he calls a native-born American, and not a member of, not some foreign immigrant or a member of a minority group. The campaign of cartoons and comic book stories also included posters. Here's a poster created by Eric Godal, whose work we were just looking at a moment ago. This is very typical of the whole strategy. Notice that as the Uncle Sam character, representing America, is kicking out the bigot. And notice that the bigot's papers include hostility towards a variety of groups. We see anti-Catholic, anti-Negro, also anti-Jewish. So it's all part of the same theme. And the idea was to argue that America, as represented by the Uncle Sam character, America should reject this un-American type of prejudice. These posters were distributed to teachers nationwide to put in their classrooms, and also labor unions to put up in their meeting halls. The idea of approaching labor groups and enlisting them in this fight was an important part of the Rothschild strategy. Here's another poster. This one's by Eric Godal again. And so here you have the typical, the working man. And notice again, he's swatting a variety of insects, each representing a different prejudice. Anti-Jewish is one of them, but other minority groups are included as well. One of the themes that you'll see again and again in Cartoonists Against Racism was how Rothschild's cartoonists would often invoke images connected to the military. Part of the reason was because this campaign took place during America's fight in World War II, although it continued for many years after. But the idea that they pushed again and again was that the sacrifices that all Americans have made are something which unite us as Americans and should overcome petty prejudice and intolerance. Notice that the names on the side of this monument represent a variety of ethnic groups and names that are typical of different religions. So you see there's Levy, there's also Kelly, and so forth. That was among the themes that these artworks returned to again and again. Another of the interesting techniques applied by Rothschild and the American Jewish Committee in fighting racism was to mimic the famous Ripley's Believe It or Not cartoon. You can still see them sometimes. They often appear today in the comic supplements of Sunday newspapers. It'll be a one-panel cartoon, and Ripley's Believe It or Not would have, let's say, 3 examples of something that was so very unusual, something you can hardly believe. So mimicking that style, Rothschild recruited the cartoonist Dick Dorgan to create a series called American Sidelights. And this is typical. There would be 3 images. 2 of them would have nothing whatsoever to do with tolerance or racism or anti-Semitism. Here you see the first image is about when was the first race between a locomotive train and a horse-drawn vehicle. And then the bottom image is just a quotation from Ben Franklin. But the middle image, that's the one that Rothschild wanted to subtly get into the minds of the readers. In the middle image, then we have 3 young men of different backgrounds. He notes they were Protestant, Jewish, and Catholic, who were part of a football team in Massachusetts, but then all enlisted, again, the military theme, and all gave their lives for their country in World War II. So the message of tolerance was sort of sneaked in to a cartoon which doesn't look like it has an educational message. It just looks like another sort of a curiosity for the reader. Among the posters that were widely distributed by Rothschild's team was this one by Vaughn Shoemaker, who was a very important figure in the history of American editorial cartooning. He was a Pulitzer Prize winner, in fact. Here we have a poster designed especially for classrooms showing kids. Here kids are getting ready to play baseball. Apparently one of them objected to the nationality of another of the kids, and so somebody sticks up for him and says, who cares, he can pitch. Racial and national differences shouldn't matter. That was an image that Rothschild's team wanted up on the walls of every classroom in America. That character at the top, by the way, peering over the top of the fence, who you see his name is Joe Dokes. This was Shoemaker's version of the character John Q. Public, which became much more popular subsequently. So this Joe Dokes is not well remembered. But in those days, Joe Dokes was the representative of like a public opinion. So it's the American public is kind of peering over the fence and learning a lesson, in effect, from the kids. The Rothschild team also approached the mainstream superhero comics publisher DC Comics, publishers of, among other things, the Batman franchise that Gorf was editor of and was just describing. In this case, they convinced the DC in the 1950s to run public service announcements, one page in length, in comic strip form, involving the main character, the popular Superboy. But in each of these little episodes, there's a message about the importance of tolerance, and of treating everybody equally and fairly and not focusing on racial or religious differences. So here Rothschild took advantage of the popularity of Superboy to encourage young people to embrace more tolerant attitudes. Finally, I want to share with you another sample from the many cartoons and posters and comic book stories that we have in the book Cartoonists Against Racism. This series of cartoons about the character Congressman Rancid. It was actually a series of one-panel cartoons involving two corrupt members of Congress. One was this Congressman Rancid, the other was Senator Bullhead. This is reminiscent of that earlier cartoon we looked at, Mr. Bigot, where it's an over-the-top ridiculing of someone who represents racism. Here it's a combination of racism and corruption. So we have this rancid congressman who, when he's the figure with the black suit, and he encounters someone writing anti-foreigner slogans on a wall, something I suppose that we have some echoes of today, he immediately wants to hire this hooligan. And in this panel, he wants him to use him in composing his next speech in Congress. This was drawn by Misha Richter, who was another very prominent editorial cartoonist in those days. He moonlighted for this campaign against racism. In the next sample from the Congressman Rancid series, we see Rancid emerging from a sewer, and he's telling his driver that he's down there digging up material to attack minority groups in my next speech. And I wanted to share this one in particular with you because we don't know exactly the date of when this cartoon was published, but it appears to have been shortly before another and much more famous cartoon using a very similar theme. This next cartoon appeared in the Washington Post in 1954. It was drawn by the Pulitzer Prize-winning cartoonist Herbert Bloch, known by his pen name Herb Bloch. And here he had Vice President Richard Nixon, then Vice President under Dwight Eisenhower, also emerging from a sewer. And Nixon was so furious about this cartoon that he publicly announced he was canceling his subscription to the Washington Post, which I'm quite sure that the cartoonist Bloch considered to be a badge of pride. Perhaps we might say in the same way that this entire campaign against racism, undertaken by a Jewish organization, but through the unique means of comics and cartoons, is very much a badge of pride for the American Jewish community. And with that, I will turn the microphone back to Olivia, and then we'll soon have questions. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Raphael and Gorf. Wonderful. Audience members, there's not a single question in the chat box, so get cracking. We need questions. There are a few comments, but I'd like you to post some questions, please, for our illustrious speakers. And I'm going to make some announcements. So now is a perfect time for you to be formulating those questions. We don't recognize raised hands, unfortunately. So we do need you to type out. We do not recognize raised hands. So Iris Borek, please write your comment in the chat box, and everyone else as well. So as a reminder, we have just a few copies left of this fabulous book. You can get it signed and inscribed by Dr. Medoff. He's going to be doing that this week, and then we'll get them out to you very quickly. So do order your copy. I'm going to show you how lushly illustrated it is. It is just a wonderful read and so interesting, a great gift, and it's just beautifully done. So do order it. and we're putting the link in the chat box. So now I'm going to tell you about a couple of programs we have upcoming here at the Sousa Mendes Foundation. So we have one more program this summer, and that is next week. We are focusing on this remarkable event that happened in the worst of all possible places. That was Auschwitz. The Auschwitz Revolt of 1944, and particularly the role of a group of women, 4 of whom were publicly executed by the Nazis for their role in the plot. And so what happened was the Sonderkommandos, who were these men who had this terrible job having to do with the crematoria, they actually blew up one of the crematoria at Auschwitz. They blew up crematorium number 4, and they did it with explosives that were gathered thimbleful by thimbleful for them by women who had access to these explosives. And it's a remarkable story because women and men were housed in totally separate areas. So it's unbelievable that they were able to do that. The most famous of these 4 women is Rosa Robota. We have here on Long Island, where the foundation is located, the Rosa Robota Foundation that was started by her cousin, Alan Mellenbaum, who will be with us. He's now 93, and he's going to tell us about his cousin and what she did. We'll also have the filmmaker joining us from Israel, and we will have Dr. Judd Newborn putting it all in context for us in the context of Jewish resistance during World War II. So it's a fascinating film. The film is called Sabotage. And then there'll be a very important, I think, discussion following it. In a minute, we will see the trailer, but first I want to tell you about one of our programs we have upcoming in September. We're now going to be focusing on September 14th, I think it is, on the refuseniks, the Soviet Jewish refuseniks, and particularly the first group of refuseniks in an operation called Operation Wedding. They were trying to get the word out to the wider world, to the free world. The Jews were suffering behind the Iron Curtain. And so this group of very brave people hijacked a plane. Ostensibly, it was to get to a wedding, which is why it was called Operation Wedding. They were all caught, and some of them served long prison sentences. And even today, they're viewed in history in Russia as having been terrorists. But in Jewish history, they're viewed as heroes. So 2 of the people who hijacked this plane did get married, or perhaps were already married. Anyway, they later on had a daughter who grew up to become a filmmaker. She then made a film about her parents and their action. The film is called Operation Wedding. So that's going to come up in September. Fascinating program that's co-sponsored by the Soviet Jewish Archive Project. And right now we're going to see a little trailer for the film Sabotage that we're going to be showing next week.
Sabotage, Sabotage! Das ist ein Verbrechen gegen das Deutsche Reich. Ein Akt der Sabotage und dafür gibt es nur eine Strafe.
Anastasia!
We kind of knew that we're not going to survive. Therefore, we're going to make our days count. When the reality becomes too painful, we have the support of each other. The reality didn't matter. You either tell yourself that you're going to die with dignity, or that you are going to survive at any cost. We have gunpowder. Can you use it? Let's try. What can happen? We're not going to come alive anyway. What the heck? We are not going to the crematorium alive. It was all very secret. Very secret. If it was dangerous, it was. We were terrified of the consequences, but not terrified enough not to do it.
Okay, so you will be receiving an email after today's program explaining how to sign up for these programs and giving you a final chance to order this book, Cartoonists Against Racism, The Secret Jewish War on Bigotry. So now let's get to some questions. Dr. Medoff, tell us about Peter Bergson and whether he was ever involved in any of these efforts.
Peter Bergson was a Jewish activist in the United States in the 1940s who led a series of rather unorthodox political action campaigns to promote the idea of rescuing Jews from the Holocaust. And that included newspaper advertisements, lobbying in Washington, marches and protests and so forth. The connection between Bergson and these cartoonists we've just been looking at is that actually Eric Godal, whose work was an important part of the anti-racism campaign, was active in the Bergson group, and his illustrations appear in some of Bergson's full-page newspaper ads urging rescue of the Jews, and in some of the Bergson group's other publications. So that was an important link, even though the Bergson group itself didn't use comics and cartoons in the same way as we've been looking at this American Jewish Committee campaign. But they understood the power of graphic illustration, because a number of those newspaper ads that Bergson placed, and altogether there were more than 200 of them that appeared in American newspapers in the 1940s, a number of them had illustrations by the famous artist Arthur Schick, who was both a painter and an editorial cartoonist. His editorial cartoons appeared in the New York Post regularly, and sometimes they were cartoons drawn specifically to try to raise public awareness of the persecution of the Jews in Europe.
Okay, well, someone else had asked about Arthur Schick, so you answered two questions in one. So can we use these lessons of the past to do the same thing today? More specifically, the person asks, how can the Jewish community counter the mystifying support for terrorist-aligned groups in Western nations? They use lies and social media propaganda, so can popular cartoons reach the same audience? And that's for either of you.
Well, I'll say this. Certainly they can help. Certainly it would be helpful to the cause of truth and defending Israel's good name if cartoonists and comic book artists would use their skills to help bring those messages to a wider audience. Today there are cartoonists who are doing that, who are bringing out important Jewish and pro-Israel messages. Gorf is certainly one of them. Unfortunately, there are other cartoonists who have been who use their cartooning skills for the opposite. But the whole idea of using cartoons for educational purposes is now considered acceptable and mainstream, whereas it was not a common thing many years ago. So,
Gorf, you have anything to add on that front?
Sure. The first thing is that it's an excellent question. I'm enjoying the chat very much, by the way. There's some really terrific questions there, and I hope we'll be able to get to as many of them as possible. To address this specific question of using the popular medium of comic strips, cartoons, graphic novels, etc., sequential storytelling to combat anti-Semitism, I would flip the question a little bit. I am presently founding an organization, a nonprofit organization called the Jewish Graphic Novel Experience. And the reason is because I travel very widely to lots of communities, literally all over the world. My motto is make Judaism your superpower. And I've recently expanded it to make Judaism and Israel your superpower. And I want to show people that the beautiful thing about this kind of communication is that it is the most simple, elemental kind of communication that you can have. It goes all the way back to caveman drawings, or I should say cave people drawings, and also hieroglyphic writing. If you can, and I do this in a Jewish cartoon workshop regularly, if you can write us words on a page, draw a stick figure, and tell a story, you can do cartoons. And therefore, this is a medium of the people. And it also is low bandwidth and highly viral, as we've seen. And I get people coming up to me all the time, especially in Israel, saying, Gorf, how can I do what you do? I want to be able to use cartoons to support the Jewish people and present a case, a positive case, for Israel. And my answer is to form an organization to be able to support all of these efforts. But for me, it's important to recast the question not as we are defining ourselves by something negative, rather we are defining ourselves by something positive. We have an amazing faith. We have an amazing tradition. We have provided the entire human race with morality and ethics and a means to live a better life constructively by healing the world, that if people only understood how great it is, they would love it too. And therefore, if we can create material that positively reinforces as opposed to echoing negative stereotypes, I believe that that is the key to combating what we are facing now and have throughout history. And I'll just add this one last thing, which is we are very small people, the Jewish people. We do have friends out there as well. There are billions of them and a few scant millions of us. There is a limit to what we can do ourselves, and therefore we need to be able to change hearts and minds of the broader world in a positive way in order to be able to build a coalition that can help us. And that is very much my approach to this question.
And Gorf, people are asking you to please repeat the name of the foundation you're establishing.
It's called the Jewish Graphic Novel Experience, JGNX for short. It is launching shortly. I have a wonderful team and putting together a board of directors, and we are fundraising. Again, it's not for profit because I believe that this is a very strong educational and cultural foundation that we are building. And if you want more information about it, you can email me at jewishcartoon@gmail.com. And I have typed that address a few times in the chat, and we will do it again. But I welcome anybody's participation, anybody's thoughts, anybody's networking. We are building a movement here. And this movement is going to use the power, the superpower of superheroes, which was invented by I saw this in the chat, by two Jewish students from Cleveland, Ohio, a stone's throw from where I'm speaking to you right now. I'm in Cleveland, Ohio right now, a stone's throw from where I am. And they created Superman because why? They wanted to be rock stars. And how back in the day were you rock stars? Well, you created a cartoon that was in newspapers and popularized everywhere. And by the way, I'm so grateful that I'm on with people who know what a newspaper is. I won't go into that. And the point is, all of that power, that the superpower that they created was done because they wanted to be popular. But then they discovered, and somebody said this in the chat, that they could combat anti-Semitism and Nazism and fascism and all the isms in the world by using Superman as a force for tikkun olam, as a force for good. And now we are echoing that all those years later. Instead of it being a comic book for a nickel or a dime, these are multi-billion-dollar film franchises. And we can take that power and we can use it to support everything that we're talking about.
Okay, so let's get back to World War II. Raphael, can you tell us about Dr. Seuss and his efforts, his editorial cartoons during the war?
Well, the world famous cartoonist, Dr. Seuss, real name Theodore Geisel, was an editorial cartoonist before he was creating children's books. In the late 1930s, early 1940s, he was the daily cartoonist for the newspaper that we mentioned earlier, PM. In fact, it was when Seuss was drafted to World War II that Eric Godal then replaced him as the cartoonist for that newspaper. Now, Seuss did not, in his cartoons, he did not frequently address questions related to Jews. He did do it a few times, and I've included examples of that in another book of mine. But there are interesting messages in some of the children's books that he created later on. I'm thinking specifically of Yertle the Turtle, which if you look at it closely, you can see is really a very thinly disguised argument against fascism. So Seuss is a fascinating character, and on the occasions that he chose to address the plight of the Jews in Europe, he drew several very powerful cartoons, but unfortunately not that many.
Okay. So several people are asking about Art Spiegelman. I know that you know him personally. What would you like to say about his contribution to this whole topic?
Well, Art Spiegelman, of course, is best known for his groundbreaking graphic novel about the Holocaust, Mouse. He and I had the opportunity to work together some years ago on a one-page comic strip for the Washington Post about it was the anniversary of the voyage of the refugee ship, the St. Louis, that President Roosevelt turned away and was sent back to Europe in 1939. Mouse was important because until its appearance, the idea of using cartoons or comic book style illustration to talk about a serious subject like the Holocaust was really unheard of. So that was a very important pioneering project, and it helped pave the way for the many graphic novels and graphic and comic book stories as well that have dealt with Holocaust themes since then. A few years back, Craig Yoe, my co-author, and I, together with the late comic book legend Neal Adams, created a book called We Spoke Out, which was about mainstream comic books that had Holocaust themes in their storylines. And this included comics like Captain America and other Batman and other mainstream heroes back in the 50s and 60s and 70s, talking about the Holocaust in comic books at a time when it was not a subject that was widely discussed in America's schools or in American society in general. So the comic book industry in some ways was ahead of its time, but in terms of taking on the subject seriously and at length, it was Spiegelman's Mouse that really paved the way for the use of comics as a means of Holocaust education today.
I want to jump in there. Dr. RAFAEL, I'm glad that you spoke about Art Spiegelman. He indeed is one of the founding fathers, as it were. And I would also cite Will Eisner. Will Eisner was, actually, do you want to address who Will Eisner was? Do you want to take that question from me?
Well, Eisner created a very important graphic novel in the late 1970s called A Contract with God, which was striking for its Jewish themes. Eisner was a pioneer in the comic book storytelling genre going back to the 1940s. He was the creator and artist of an extremely popular newspaper comic strip called The Spirit. And then in later years, he was arguably one of the founders of the whole idea of a graphic novel in this book, A Contract with God. Interestingly, Eisner's very final book, just before he passed away, was a graphic novel expose of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. He took that infamous anti-Semitic tract and he traced its origins and refuted it passage by passage, but in comic book story style form. It's a fascinating book and a remarkable final achievement to an extraordinary artist and creator.
We have somebody in our audience who is mentioning something personal, and I don't know if you want to respond to it. She says, please mention the parallel history in the wake of Truman's 1947 executive order in which anti-racism imagery was considered disloyal. I know this because when my father was fired from his job in 1953, allegedly for his disloyalty, the evidence against him included 18 leaflets that he had handed out, including many that advocated against racism and discrimination. So what can you add to that, if anything?
Well, that's very interesting, and I'd like to ask that questioner to contact me after the program through the Sousa Mendez Foundation so we can discuss it at length. That's not a subject that I personally have researched, but I'd like to hear more about it. So please be in touch.
Okay, I'm sorry, Gorf, you were saying something and I think I cut you off.
Oh, no, not at all. I stepped on you. I apologize. That's the disadvantage of Zoom. But it's fine. Let's take more questions from people since we're running low on time.
So there are not that many more questions. There is a question about Superman. If somebody can talk more about Superman fighting the Nazis during World War II, I mean, just to give us a little refresher.
Yeah, and actually, there's one other question that is part and parcel with that, which is, are there any metrics about how successful this American Jewish Committee's, if I'm remembering the organization correctly, efforts were? I mean, these cartoons actually get out there? Do people purchase them? Do we know if people read them? Were they affected by them? What was the result?
We do know that they appeared in hundreds of newspapers and thousands of classrooms, and many labor union meeting halls. Their impact, however, is more difficult to measure. Richard Rothschild was convinced that the campaign was extremely successful. He gave an oral history memoir many years later, and looking back at how racism was in retreat in America in the 1960s, he felt that by saturating, as he put it, saturating the American media and classrooms with these kinds of anti-racism materials, he felt it must have had some impact in convincing, especially younger people, to adopt more tolerant attitudes.
So
I have to say, as a historian, though, I'm not entirely persuaded. I think historians have to admit when we don't have the answers, because racism certainly has diminished significantly in American society over the years, but it's far from stamped out. Anti-Semitism, in fact, has increased. It's taken on new forms and new frightening dimensions that we could never have anticipated. I wonder what Richard Rothschild would think today if he saw the explosion of anti-Semitism on college campuses and in America's streets, the desecrations of synagogues, and much of it coming from a political direction that he would not have expected, given where anti-Semitism came from back in the 40s and 50s. So what impact did it have? Hard to say. The only thing I'm really confident about saying is they fought the good fight, and they used their creative imaginations to bring in people who were not normally associated with fighting against racism. And they said what was right. They did the right thing. They tried. And you never know what impact your efforts will have. Sometimes these kinds of struggles go on for years and years, and you don't know how long it'll take or how much impact you'll have, but you have to try. And they did.
So Gorf, are there any words you'd like to say to our audience in closing?
In closing, thank you very much for coming, and thank you very much for the Mendez Foundation for having this program. It seems to have been well received. And I think I just want to echo what Dr. Raphael said, which was history is a circle, is a cycle, the circle of life. And what we saw happening in the 30s and 40s, we're seeing again now. And the way it was combated using cartoons in the 30s and 40s, we can do now, and it can be amplified greatly through the various means of communication that we didn't have back then. The very social media that is being used against us can be used for us. And for anybody who wants to take part in that effort, we need all hands on deck. So you know who's doing it and you know where to reach out to. Please, let's hear from you. And thank you for your support and thank you for coming.
Raphael, anything else you'd like to add?
I think the most important quality in confronting racism and anti-Semitism is persistence. It's crucially important that we never become exhausted by the constant onslaught of anti-Israel hostility and anti-Semitism that we're witnessing every day. It's very easy to become dejected and to feel like there's no way to combat it. And so I think what's crucially important is that we remain determined and look for new ways, whether it's unorthodox means like comics and cartoon illustrations, or other types of strategies. But the most important thing is to never give up.
So I do see orders flooding my inbox, which is terrific. But you still have an opportunity to get your signed and inscribed copy. Please do. Raphael will be happy to inscribe it to whoever you say and with whatever message you would like to have him convey. So thank you all. Thank you to our amazing panelists. Thank you to our wonderful audience that comes to all of our programs. So we will see you again next week. Have a wonderful rest of your Sunday. Be well, everybody. Take care. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.